Wait a minute, you got a whole lot of treasure here.
Here, you want to move this over so the two of you have it?
Okay, Caroline.
No, he's not, he's moving.
I want to move because.
Oh, wow.
Who was supposed to be here?
The wisest decision was to not give me a microphone, so.
Huh?
Cares.
Planning that.
Who knows?
Testing, testing. I think we're good to go. Can you hear us online, Caroline?
Yep, sure can.
Perfect, thank you. Hope you're feeling better today.
Okay, it's
I'm good.
7:03 PM, and I'm calling the joint planning board, select board meeting to order. For the edification of those attending via Zoom, this meeting is being recorded. At this point, I will take roll call for planning board members. So planning board members, when I call your name, would you please indicate that you're present? Jonathan Poor,
Jonathan Poor, present.
Bill Wheaton,
Bill Wheaton, present.
Rick Mitchell,
Here.
Richard Boroff,
Richard Boroff, present.
Pat Norton.
Here.
And I note for the record that Beth Herr is not present, and Emil.
I'm here.
Oh, you're on Zoom. Beth Herr then present. You can announce that, thank you. And I can announce that Emil Dahlquist is under the weather and will not be able to join us this evening.
Madam Chair, could I make the announcement that we have a new associate member, Matthew Hamill, who is joining us tonight via Zoom as well.
Oh, okay. Welcome.
Thank you very much, President.
You can indicate that you're present. Matt Hamill.
Matt Hamill, present. Thank you, guys.
All right, I'll set Marnie and I'll call my folks. that
Yes,
were in.
please.
All right, since Marnie already called the meeting to order, we'll do a roll call for the select board because we've got a online member as well. So we'll start with Caroline.
Caroline Bowie, present.
Jamie,
Jamie Knutson.
and Sean Farrell present. We have a quorum.
Well, if no one objects, I want to take this opportunity to recognize the contributions and hard work of the participants to this Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary Reuse Initiative, including the seminary representatives, town officials, and the consultants Barry Abramson and David Gamble, as well as John Witten, whom I believe is present on Zoom.
I am. Good evening, Madam Chair.
Yes, good evening. I want to share with you some information about the work of the planning board, so you have a real clear understanding.
Marnie, excuse me, can you speak in the mic? I can't hear you very well.
Oh, sorry.
Thank
Is that better, Richard?
That's better.
I think so.
In these past 4 months. And I would also like to hear from the seminary and the select board, but I note that right before the meeting, we did get a PowerPoint from the seminary, so thank you for that. And in addition to hearing from those participants, John Witten has agreed to comment on concept plans and his experience with overlay districts at town meeting. The powers and the duties of the planning board are set forth in section 10.5 of the Hamilton zoning bylaw. And in fulfilling those duties, the planning board is guided by the principles and recommendations set forth in our 2004 master plan that was overseen by Judy Barrett, who is now the consultant to the master plan that is being prepared as we speak. The master plan was present and recognized the seminary site as one for higher density development for a mix of residential uses, including affordable housing, as well as recommending a mix of land uses that make environmental, social, and fiscal goals compatible instead of putting them at odds. That was a quote. As Judy Barrett recognized in the master plan, good planning can be thought of as a three-legged stool, where economic, social, and environmental needs are balanced. Remove one leg and the stool is no longer suitable for its intended use. Indeed, both the planning board and the consultants agree that balancing fiscal, social, and environmental benefits to the town and the seminary is a critical planning principle. The purpose of the planning board's presentation, which will be very short, is to demonstrate that the unique environmental and historic characteristics of the site, with its opportunities for public access and protection of landscape features, is consistent with the goal of generating fiscal benefits to the town, benefits that will be greater than if a piecemeal, haphazard development of the campus is undertaken that may destroy its character, beauty, and development potentials. So I'm going to let Jonathan take over for a brief period to really summarize the work of the planning board, which is in the process timeline, which Patrick Reffert should have distributed to everyone.
So I don't have any formal prepared presentation here. I was asked to take this over in Emil's place in Emil's absence because of his health issues. So I'm just going to go quickly through this in an
Jonathan,
informal manner.
You want to reference the handout?
I'm going to, yeah.
Oh, okay.
So you're talking about our timeline handout.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm just going to quickly run through it. I'm not going to go through every page, and there's no slideshow on this. So, but everybody should have received this. So just to very, very quickly run through the timeline of what the planning board has sort of participated in and worked on is starting with the workshops. A number of the planning board members participated in those public workshops. The planning board, together in organized groups and also independently, did a number of site assessment walks and digested what we saw on site and tried to delineate what was unique and special about the campus, and then turned those into guiding principles, which were a supplemental kind of approach to what the consultants had provided us. And then, in addition to that, we worked from the guiding principles towards a set of preferences that was part of a workshop that the planning board undertook as a group project, sort of a roundtable project. And again, what we did is we took the consultants' preferences and just elaborated on those with the additional work that we had done. And again, those are in this timeline handout. Then we worked from the preferences through some examples of layouts and examples of zones, just to get a feel for how the process might unfold from there. In other words, how do you turn some of these site observations and preferences about what's valuable about the site, what are the site assets, how would you turn those into layouted ideas? And again, these were sort of riffs and elaborations on the consultants' work. And from there, we experimented with 3 levels of density, low density, medium density, high density, to not necessarily make it a scenario where you had to pick one, but really to build a flexible menu that you could order off of and craft a bylaw or a development agreement off of. And again, those were an elaboration of what some of the consultants' work was. And then what we did after that is we tried to we looked at our variety of design explorations and examples, and we tried to distill what the patterns were that we were seeing. And what was interesting about the patterns that we were seeing was that there were very clear opportunities to marry the preferences and the guiding principles into a very efficient and high-density, high-yield development. And that was what was interesting about that process. And so we really leaned into that and to see if we could, and we were, again, using the consultants' metrics, their charts that have been freely circulated around density and square footage and potential tax return and yield on development. And we tried to, again, elaborate, take it a step further. And we were able to actually increase some of the yields from the scenarios, and which was demonstrated in our last presentation and is in this timeline. And so, and then what we did is we again revisited what could we learn from looking at all these different scenarios, how could we distill this into some sort of a concept plan that would capture what we learned from the distillation process? And that is how we came up with what Emil labeled the plan, which is, or the map, rather, the map.
Recording in progress.
And what it does is it kind of generalizes some of the principles that we saw, common principles that we saw in experimenting with low, medium, and high density, especially most of this focus was on the middle campus, because that's where the most variables and the most interesting opportunities are. The upper campus is pretty much all open flat space and large existing buildings. It's in a sense, it designs itself. You can't build on the water tanks. You can't build on the steep slopes. So it pretty much predicates where you can and can't do things. The dorms are the dorms. So most of the interesting opportunities lie in the central campus, and that's where we spent most of our effort. And it's also in the central campus where you can really look at what are the opportunities of achieving maximum density and marrying that to some of the preferences that have been expressed in various ways by the public, the consultants, and the board, which include making sure that we maximize meaningful open space, both for the folks who live into that property, develop that property, and also for the public. Making provision for preserving buffers between uses, between more commercial and less commercial uses, residential uses, and creating meaningful pedestrian connections, and creating kind of a sense of campus and a sense of identity in each neighborhood, preserving steep slopes, and doing our best to preserve mature specimen trees. And we found that we were able to achieve quite a high degree of density and meet a lot of those preferences. And so that's what's reflected in the concept plan that was most recently shared. And a few just examples of what we felt were germane about that plan these are just examples. Number one, we tried to provide the ability to expand the utility septic system in a way that created flexibility for future development, and in addition, in some sense, replicated the open space that we would be disturbing in the existing open field where most of the development was. We also looked at what would likely be a scenario if the development built out to an extent where you needed additional site access for both safety and traffic management. So we looked at where would the best place for an additional curb cut be, and what are the best sight lines around that, how could we be most sensitive to the abutters, and how could we position and lay out that entry point so that it still provided a baffle or a buffer to passersby and abutters, so that the principle there is you offset your road alignment so that you can have landscape buffer. You're not looking straight in at whatever the development is. It's baffled or buffered. So those are just a few examples. Another example would be we looked at traffic calming principles and tried to marry those to some other features that are likely to be needed. For example, stormwater management will be needed. You may need a retention pond, and rather than having it disturb some other aspect of the site that might be valuable, like an existing building or an existing open space, or another area that might be useful for new construction, we incorporated it into some of the traffic calming principles of some sort of a rotary. So whenever we had a four-way intersection, we worked on trying to make sure that that was a safe intersection. So those are just a few examples of what some of the pieces were that we were looking at. One other piece that I think is critical and was kind of the linchpin for creating greater density and still preserving some of the preferences is, instead of thinking of the dorms as separate, we thought of them as opportunities for denser neighborhoods. So for example, around dorms E and F, we experimented with clustering buildings around those areas and found that it really worked well for both improving parking, improving the sort of sense of neighborhood around those buildings so that they're not just isolated, and creating greater flexibility and density without, again, compromising the preferences. That was one of the key elements where we found we were able to create greater density and still preserve a lot of the preferences. So just leaning into this a little bit harder, we found lots of areas for an increased flexibility, increased density, but still marrying that, not compromising, marrying that to the preferences that we've really kind of heard from everybody involved, including the seminary, preserving the campus feel. So what I'd like to also just quickly mention, and then I think, Marnie, we wanted to turn it over to John Whitten, is I want to just talk about briefly the concept of flexibility. I've done quite a bit of campus planning, and in both a proactive manner, where I've been asked to work with nonprofits and schools and corporations to create kind of a flexible armature on which an organization can grow into, and but not lock them into a specific scenario in the future, but really create the components of that framework that they can really work off of flexibly in the future. So I've been asked to do that, and often, even more frequently, I've been asked to come in and troubleshoot. And that's what I want to focus on right now for just a moment, and then turn it over to the next person. And I've been very frequently asked to come in and look at a campus situation where something is partially built out or, unfortunately, fully built out, and we're confronted with kind of limitations. And the limitations often were accidentally self-imposed, kind of a whoops, where if there had been a little bit more forethought, a road would have been in a different place. A utility feature might have been in a different place. A transformer might have been in a different place. A building might have been in a different place. But instead, because it was piecemeal problem solving, those elements precluded the next step in development. And I have been brought in countless times to figure out how to work around those oopses. We'll call them, in the game of chess, check. And in the worst cases, checkmate, where there's no place to go. Sometimes there is a place to go, sometimes there isn't. So what I want to really kind of drive home here is that there's flexibility, and then there's piecemeal problem solving that can often lead to what Marnie has mentioned, unintended consequences. What I'll say is missed opportunities of expansion, missed opportunities of income, missed opportunities of amenities. So I think that this exercise is optimally a balance of creating a meaningful armature or framework upon which you develop a project, and then within that, leaving as many areas of flexibility that allow you to, in this case, adjust density, adjust building type, adjust uses within the uses that you prefer, and at the same time preserve the things that you're wishing to preserve. But that's only done with some degree of specificity so you understand the framework and you don't accidentally hit checkmate. So I'll stop there.
Okay, and at this point, I think what Jonathan was really getting at is a vision for the site. But before Attorney Whitten speaks,
Marnie, we can't hear you.
sorry.
Please.
Emil was reviewing his concept plan, and he discovered that the seminary is actually in the groundwater overlay protection district. And it's also in the Zone 2 wellhead protection area. So that means that the underlying zoning is not actually R1B. It's the Groundwater Overlay Protection District, and that means that any development within the Groundwater Overlay Protection District is 80,000 square foot minimum. And in addition, the provisions of the overlay district, the Groundwater Overlay District, provide that all development within that district is by special permit. So that's a consideration that is now in play and will have to be addressed, but it does require some consideration as to how to address that issue. It can be addressed, but we'll need to think about how best to do that. We have the maps, if anybody is interested in seeing them, that shows the GPOD as well as the Groundwater Protection Overlay District. I'm sorry, the Zone 2 wellhead protection area.
Marty, can I ask if Pat or Patrick has the map that Jonathan was referring to, and that I think when you turn it over to Jonathan Witten, he's going to be talking about a concept plan, so that the people who are in the audience, and this is this plan. Yeah.
So I have 10 of these in this size that happy to hand around.
Well, it would be good to pass out so that people in the audience know what we're talking about and what you're referencing in a future conversation.
That map is part of the handout, the process timeline.
Yeah, it's the same.
Okay.
But if somebody needs a separate piece of paper, here it is.
If I can just interrupt for a second, it's kind of a side note, it's just really a point of order. We have Tom Myers on the select board, joined us maybe 20 minutes ago during John's presentation, so just note for the minutes.
So you might want to pass out those maps, because I don't think everybody has
Okay.
the handout that we
If
have.
it's in the packet, I've got it twice.
Okay.
Electronically and printed out.
Does everybody have that map?
Which one is it, please?
It's this map. This is the last map. This is what,
It's actually on, I believe, page,
not everybody got the handout.
oh, not every, I didn't.
And for those people that are not in the, at this meeting, again, I'm wondering if, Pat, you have this, then you can call it up and put it on the screen.
I'm working on it. I'm not sure, is that a separate attachment as a full-size drawing?
Well, this was sent,
It's
this was,
Okay, I'll find it.
It's reduced in the packet there.
Yeah,
it was sent out as a separate attachment probably 2 weeks ago as well.
Right, at our, what was our last meeting, February 23rd?
yeah. Okay, cool.
It-
And just a note, that map is based on, again, the distillation of the board's exercise in exploring low, medium, and high-density build-outs. So did you want John Whitten to?
Yes, Attorney Witten, are you ready to make your remarks?
I am, Madam Chair. Good evening, members of the Planning Board, members of the Select Board. So Jonathan just spoke in very detailed fashion about the plan and about a concept plan. I want to maybe speak much more generally for a moment and be very brief, because I'm just going to repeat what we've talked about before. There's really two things happening at the same time. Town meeting's being asked to adopt a new zoning district, new zoning overlay, and new zoning bylaw provisions, however we're going to fashion those. But town meeting is also going to be informed that there'll be a contract between the town and the seminary. The contract's going to include things that the zoning bylaw can't or shouldn't. It's going to be an agreement that the seminary and the town reach in terms of quid pro quos. What is the seminary providing for the town? What is the town providing for the seminary? It's a public process, but it's a contract. Because it's a contract, it's going to run with the land, and it's going to bind the successors in title to the land. The zoning bylaw, of course, can change. Town meeting can revise the zoning bylaw virtually anytime it chooses. So these two approaches, they work hand in hand. One relates to the other. The contract won't be executed if there's an agreement. The contract won't be executed at town meeting, but the town meeting voters can be assured that there is an agreement ready to be executed. So the zoning has to precede the contract, but the two can be ready at the same time. I think, Madam Chair and Mr. Chair, I think the only thing for me at this point as to what needs to be accomplished is what is it that the seminary will agree to relative to the future use of the property under the new zoning regime. We've talked conceptually, and then we've talked in detail, for example, tonight. But I think at this point, it's really important for the seminary to articulate what it is it wants, and then the respective boards and town meeting can shape a response to what it wants. Because I don't think the town should be designing the development. The town can respond to a development, the town can set a framework for a development, but the development proposals need to come from the owner of the parcel. So, Madam Chair, I think that's really what I intended to say tonight. I'm happy to go further, but that's really the two big issues for me. The concept plan and the development agreement, they go hand in hand, but the municipality needs to know what the applicant is looking for in some detail.
Well, the question that I have is one relative to your experience. And I've been trying to be a good student of all the information that's available about concept plans. And it's certainly my understanding that in going to town meeting, if members of the public have a vision about what this site will look like, and they can see on a map where development might occur and what the density might mean to them as abutters or neighbors or in town. So it's the visual component that is compelling to them, because the words in and of themselves, without reference to a map with that vision, is very abstract. And if there is no overarching armature, as Jonathan said, to indicate where and how the development might look, they will be really hamstrung to approve something that is amorphous. And to ask them to approve piecemeal development, if you will, whenever and however it occurs, just based on, say, square footage alone, is, I think, maybe a bit of a gamble on the part of everyone here tonight. And I don't know if that is your experience or not. But I think that the vision is very important to be transmitted to the public.
I completely agree. I mean, if we were in most other states other than Massachusetts, we would have the zoning be reflective of a comprehensive plan. That's essentially what we're talking about with the concept plan. It is the vision, as you say, Madam Chair, as Jonathan said, as Emil has said in the past, it's the vision for the parcel. And then zoning will implement that vision. That's why, again, in my opinion, I think the landowner, the seminary, needs to, and I know they will, but needs to articulate their understanding of the vision, and then there'll be a common cause. But there's a famous quote from a California case, a land use case, where the court said the tail doesn't wag the dog. And what the court meant was the plan is the guidance document and zoning fulfills the plan, not the other way around. In Massachusetts, there's no planning requirement, so it's a problem. But here, this is the planning requirement. The concept plan is the vision, and then zoning will implement the plan. And that's really the way to get, I think, town meeting comfortable with both the vision and the implementation, as you say, Madam Chair.
Can I ask a question? John, on the screen, we have quote-unquote a concept plan. I'm thinking, and I'd like your opinion, is the next step at some point would be to then put pencil to this, define the uses and the densities within this concept plan before you take it to a town meeting.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And so it's ceilings and floors. The floor is the underlying zoning, and the ceiling is what, based on the consulting advice you've had, your own comfort level and the public's comfort level, the ceiling is going to be the maximum use of the zone or the portion of the concept plan. The only other option, which I have seen, and it can work, is to have a very aggressive special permit requirement with no maximum. Now, again, just as a concept, the maximum could be 200,000 square feet commercial. The other option could be to have a special permit requirement that is very aggressive and rigorous, but no objective cap. So if I can convince the special permit granting authority, the planning board, that it should be more like 350,000 square feet, I would have the opportunity to do it, but the conditions of doing so would be rigorous. So that's another option, maximum or some way to be flexible with some burdensome criteria as we reach the upper end.
Thank you.
So if I can back up a little bit, John, when you're talking about kind of working with the seminary about how they feel about what we've done so far in some of the concept planning, you know, just to kind of check a box here that I think is low-hanging fruit, and we've got two members of the seminary here tonight. We've talked within the working group and the planning board and the select board about this kind of three sections of campus, an upper, middle, and lower campus. And I don't believe the seminary has spoken in and said, yes, we kind of agree with that concept, but I think they do, if I'm speaking for them. But I think that would help us with kind of checking one more box along the way of delineating those sections that help us zone within each of those. And then I believe you said some more about what they're looking for on the site, which would be helpful for us to help us start the kind of zoning with those ceilings and floors for the different densities and industries that they're thinking about marketing to. So I don't know if Ken or Marilyn, you want to just talk briefly about the sections and
I think that'll be in our presentation.
Okay.
So, can I just venture an opinion here?
Sure. I was going to make one point, though.
Go.
And just for everyone's edification, in the process timeline, we, on, I think it's page 6, they're small, but we do have maps, larger maps, showing low, medium, and high density. And on those maps, there are buildings that are placed there. Now, that type of a plan has been described as an idealized build-out design. It's not to be necessarily followed exactly, but it does show how development can occur, and it can be it can really show people what can happen, and it enables decision-making to proceed apace as things develop over time. But so any developer who came in and wanted to build something would know that if it were a higher density usage, if they followed that model, that they would have smooth sailing through the permitting process. It would basically be thank you very much. I mean, there would be everything, the planning board would do everything to expedite and facilitate the development if it followed those kinds of schematics. And again, one thing that I don't think happened in the workshop process, and David, you could correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think the public ever had a chance to really weigh in as to the level of intensity of development that it would be comfortable with. So, different scenarios may have been presented, but it doesn't appear to me that we ever reached any type of consensus among the public at those workshops which level of density would be acceptable. Obviously, low density probably would be. But I will also say this, Jonathan has made the observation that right now the seminary site is not well lit. And I happened to drive by, along Woodbury and then Bridge Street the other day, and that is true. The seminary is not a bright beacon on the hill. And so any type of development there would very drastically affect the light flowing from the site, even at its most best level, dark sky compliant and whatnot. So, that might be a concern to the abutters in particular, and so there are several considerations like that can impact the level of density that the public might be comfortable with. But I think that I would speak for everyone that the upper campus, as everyone has observed, is probably user-driven. We don't know what is likely to happen up there, whether that the buildings would be reused, modified and expanded, or scrape clean. So the upper campus is almost its own, it really is its own zone. The lower campus with the apartments, again, there's relative consensus there, although in Emil and Jonathan's drawing, there's an opportunity for more development, at least around buildings E and F. So it's the central campus that has, I think, that the most opportunities, and maybe it's clear to me that it requires kind of special handling because it's really so integral to the uniqueness of the site. So I will stop there. And Rick, now with my interruption of you, please go ahead. If you can remember what you were going to say.
Yeah. I'll make up something then. I think the point that you're trying to make, and Emil and Jonathan are trying to make, is the three drawings you see are theoretical possibilities that could occur on this site. And I think what we're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is we don't know exactly what's going to happen there, but we can, within those sites, prescribe some level of density, as you said, and we are not there yet, but I'll give an example. We talked about this already. With the existing 209 units of student housing, and we said, and with the other existing buildings, those could be developed by right. And by right is a pretty simple, low hurdle requirement that a potential developer can come in and redevelop those properties and only come before the planning board for a site plan review. And a site plan review allows really a negotiation with the applicant on things that they might do to enhance the appearance, lower the lighting levels. But in site plan review, the planning board does not have the authority to make the development untenable, economically untenable. So it's a pretty easy process. And the planning board has been through this, at least I have been, a number of times. So, and as Marnie said, if we can come to some agreement, and again, clarify if I'm wrong, Marnie, on sort of this base concept map and uses within those, it's pretty flexible as to what can happen there. And we could say, and again, I may be going off the deep end, the medium density is sort of where you say, okay, we're kind of comfortable with that as a base, and within this map, this map, the one without the showing the drawings, if you adhere to the basic layout and preservation of vistas and open space and buffering, then your permitting is going to be relatively easy, as it should be.
Absolutely. And
So,
let me just reiterate, I agree with you 100%.
Into the microphone so people can hear you.
I agree with you 100%. And at this point, I will say it's the planning board very much wants this to work. And we want the town to get the maximum dollars for the best plan. And so making it easy for developers should garner some tax revenue, as
Right.
opposed to making it.
Right, and so the rub, and I think where we're going to have fun, people think I'm crazy saying fun, but I think this is it's a productive exercise, is we're going to be negotiating among ourselves in terms of the densities we feel comfortable with and the types of uses, but also with the seminary. And I think this gets to the question is, this may not be the forum, and it might be better done in a negotiation session, but we really need to get down to brass tacks on, A, is the seminary staying or going? And if so, when? And if they're staying, where? And what uses are they going to be encumbered the campus with? Because that's impacting what we can and will be willing to do. The other is, I know in the presentation that Ken's going to provide, he has laid out some scenarios that they'd like to see, and quite honest and quite honestly and understandably, they want the least amount of burden and restriction and the maximum amount of potential development. And that's where we're going to be negotiating. And so I think that's this, after we get over this meeting, that's where the rubber meets the road, is we're going to be making some tough decisions. We're going to be asking for concessions, and I'm sure you're going to be asking for concessions from us. And I look forward to that, because then I think there's where we take the concepts and the things that we've talked about protecting and preserving and saying, okay, now how do we make this work?
Well, the other real question here is, and Barry Abramson, I think, made this pretty crystal clear, that the market forces right now favor residential development of all sorts. The market for office space, I think, is dead on arrival, and I can't even see that as a possibility for years to come. I mean, at least 3 or 4 or 5 years. I just don't see it. I don't know that office space as we, used to know it, commuting into Boston to the office, will ever be the same again after the pandemic. But someone could prove me wrong. But so the life science model, again, what's the timeline for development here? Does the seminary intend to hold out for years until some white knight comes along to really come up with something? Or is there going to be development over the next year or two? Senior housing, 55 plus, always a winner for the town, if done correctly. Is a real possibility on that site, and then the site really would lend itself to some really nice residential development in townhouses and apartments, obviously, the kind of diversity in housing stock that we lack now. So,
Part of the real question is, to what part of what you were talking about, can the seminary afford to hold out for years? Or do they need to do something which will bring them, if they exist, income in a relatively immediate time frame?
I think we should let them
if I could speak for them, I would, but I can't.
But I guess if I can bring us back around a little bit to John Witten's comments about kind of where we are and where we're trying to go. I think we're getting a little bit off track here. So, tonight I think we're talking about our concept plan and not really getting too much into the weeds about different things, but that overall concept plan is where we kind of need to start. And then, as John said, we're trying to figure out our kind of densities and our ceilings for different things like that. And I think, as Rick mentioned earlier, I think the select board, the seminary, and the planning board all agree that the student housing at the moment is kind of pretty much the best place for by right. I think we all agree on that. And then it's with the negotiations of kind of, if that is going to be some type of housing, will it be market rate? Will it be affordable? What's the ratios and things like that? That can be determined later. But I think if those buildings are reused, I think that's a low-hanging fruit home run because it's already there, and then that's by right. And then they'll probably need some ADA modifications, outside elevators, very similar to what Andrew DeFranz's plan was originally when they looked at that site. But I think, if we use that as a starting point and we all agree on that, then we can kind of check that box off and move on to the bigger concepts of the central and upper campus and what those densities are. Because we know that residential housing, whether it's market rate or affordable or whatever it is going to have that same amount of cars and traffic coming from it and stormwater and all that kind of stuff. That's kind of a known for us, and the rest of the campus is unknown at the moment. So this one's kind of the easiest one to kind of check off if we wanted to kind of start tackling different areas that were a little bit less work and then dive into the more extensive kind of thought process on the overall concepts. Mark Johnson, did you want to say something? Come on up to the mic.
Mark Johnson, Patton Drive. Very quickly, just on the concept of the concept plan, love it. But it's really, I would encourage the planning board, if they want to have a really good dialogue with the town about what the concept plan should be, what densities, that is not a good forum for town meeting floor. Town meeting floor is really good for A or B, maybe an amendment or two, but the nuances that you want to get from town meeting residents is going to be much deeper if the planning board holds its own session with real input from neighbors, because doing that on town meeting floor is going to lead to some really weird directions.
Oh, no, we would have to have public hearings well in advance on any overlay
I was just
district.
earlier you had said that, you wanted to have residents have on town meeting floor that observation, and I was like, no, that would be the wrong place. It's a good conversation, necessary conversation. Wrong place is town meeting floor.
Needs to be right here.
Is this time for the seminary to make their presentation?
Yes, no, I was waiting for any kind of questions or whatnot.
Well, do you want to drive it, or?
If I put my drive in there, then
I think I was emailed.
oh, you have the emails. That'll work just as well.
I think I do.
My whole life is on this little.
That's quite a life.
Pat, do you have the email?
Yeah.
Okay.
When you want it, you got yours.
What's going on there, David?
Spider wrangling?
Trying to get a stink bug out.
Stink bug, yeah. Get him out.
You'll find out soon if I got him.
Oh, is it a poisonous?
No,
No.
stink bug.
Stink bug.
Snake bug.
Where's the horse?
5:35 today.
I'll just deposit that outside.
Patrick, you wouldn't mind clicking when I ask?
Yeah, I'll be your assistant.
You'll be the clicker if you go to the front page. Thank you. Thank you. Great. So, first of all, let me just say to the chairs of this combined meeting, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. the process has been going on for quite a while now. And there have been times when it's felt like we're in silos. And I think that was somewhat demonstrated in the timeline document. There are a few pages there where there was a lot of activity on the planning board side, and then just one or two one-liners from the seminary as though we were not engaged. We were very, very engaged, as you well know, not just with the consultants and with the select board, but we attended every single one of your meetings. But we were guests. We were on Zoom and we were watching. And so we are really thankful for the invitation to come here now and present to you, if you will, how we think things are going. And I have to say that our timeline goes back just a tiny bit further than yours. So if you would be kind enough, Patrick, to go to the next. So in the fall of 2019, our new president, who, by the way, sends his apologies, but he's lecturing tonight, he's doing his day job, began a strategic planning process for the seminary because our sector has gone through more disruption than any other sector in the country right now. And it was exacerbated by the March 2020 COVID disruption as well. Simply because we are a graduate school. And consequently, most of our students are mature students. And even though when I was a student there almost 40 years ago, and I physically moved my family to Hamilton, lived on campus, et cetera, because that's where the teaching and the learning happened, the technology has proven, and it was exacerbated by COVID, that an awful lot of the teaching and learning can happen online. So, of course, a mature student isn't going to move cross-country to live on campus if they can get most or all of their degree online. So it's completely disrupted our model, and we're not the only ones. Obviously, we've read a million campuses and things that are shutting down. So as part of the strategic plan, a contract was developed between ourselves and Harbor Light to sell some of the apartments for use for affordable housing, which the town was interested in because of your requirements under 40B. But of course, the option they had for all of the apartments, should that ever happen, we weren't intending to sell them all 209 in one go, but they wanted options for that. Meant that they made the application for all 209, and that set the cat amongst the pigeons, as we say back in England. And so the town came to us at about the same time because of your own planning, your master plan, which you referenced, Madam Chair, about the site, the seminary site, being recognized as a good place for affordable housing and other more density, high-density usages.
Keep going.
Okay. So the town came to us and said, would you be interested in the possibility of a commercial overlay for the campus? And we said, yes, that's something certainly we'd think about. But at the same time, because the Harbor Light application was before the ZBA, and people started to ask questions about, are we going to have 209 affordable housing units, in this semi-rural area, that Rick and others came to us and said, look, would you consider having a consultation with us, because we don't want to do it piecemeal. We think it's in everyone's best interest if we approach this from a rezoning overlay for the whole site, so that everybody can agree and understand what's best for the seminary, what's best for the town, what's best for the abutters, et cetera. And we agreed to that. And I don't mind saying there's considerable risk in us agreeing to that, because we asked Harbor Light to withdraw their application, and we canceled our purchase and sale agreement. We returned their deposit. In addition to that, we've spent about $100,000, not to mention untold man hours, working on this project because we believe in it. And I have to say that we have been really impressed with the process. There's been a tremendous esprit de corps, in my opinion, between the members of the working group, ourselves, Rick, who's on it, who kind of quasi-represents the planning board, but not officially. Of course, Joe and Sean are on it. Myron is on it. And we've been working with the consultants who have been fantastic. I think everyone agrees. Abramson and Gamble have done a fantastic job. And we have, thank you. And we have, we've decided to continue down this road in order to ensure that whatever comes out, everyone agrees is a win-win. Now, as part of this process, there have been several iterations, if you will, of the concept plan. And I want to unpack that a little bit in a minute. But if you go to the next slide, please. I'm sorry, go back one more. The February 23rd meeting is when we all agreed that we would have this meeting, because we wanted to avoid going in silos, or even worse, going in divergent directions. And that's what we're here for. On the March 3rd meeting, which was in between that meeting and this meeting, was the first time we saw the sector plan, which is what Emil referred to it as, and Jonathan put the picture up a minute ago. So we want to talk about some of those things. Thank you. Now, if you could go ahead. Thank you, Pat. So these are the people on the board on the left. I want to say that we are still very committed to a win-win solution. In all due respect, Rick, we don't view this as a negotiation. We view this as a conversation. We really, really want it to be in that spirit. I didn't go to law school. I went to seminary, so I have a different approach. And we are sensitive to the needs of all of the stakeholders. And that includes the taxpayers, who have a very, very serious interest in this. The kind of numbers that have been thrown out, both by yourselves and by the consultants, come to about 5% of the town's annual budget. That's not small beer. And so the abutters, of course, are very important, but they are only one of the constituencies that we need to think about. So if we could go to the next slide, please. We all agree nobody wants this. I mean, that is just 55 of the McMansions that the consultants confirmed are a net negative to the town, and frankly, we don't get nearly what the property is worth if it's sold for that. So nobody wants that. We all agree with that. Why do we keep talking about it? Because we may find ourselves in a situation where we have no choice, and we certainly don't want that to happen. In answer to your question about the seminary's financial position, let me be clear about that. Okay. In answer to the question about the seminary's financial situation, our finances are public record. You can go to the website and you can see our audited accounts. We have finished on an EBITDA basis the last few years in the black, actually, but it's largely because of assistance from the government related to COVID. Our enrollment continues to be under pressure because of the things I mentioned. So as we look into the future, we see that our income statement is going to be under significant pressure in the immediate future until we right-size our operation. We're fortunate that we have a strong balance sheet. We have a strong balance sheet. And so I don't want anyone to think that the bailiffs are at the door, because the bailiffs aren't at the door. But I also don't want anyone to think that there isn't urgency here, because there is urgency here, because if you continue to have losses on your income statement for any length of time, you start to get into a danger zone with the accrediting agencies, and if we lose our accreditation, we lose everything. So please understand, it seems like an anomaly. Wait a minute. Either you are financially under stress or you're not. Well, our financial stress isn't just balance sheet financial stress. It's what happens with our accreditation. So that's why cash is important. That's why time is important to us. If we could go to the next slide, please. Here's the good news. I think that there is a lot of agreement already, and I'd like to see if we can leave this meeting tonight in virtual agreement that things that we could start drafting bylaws for. First of all, we agree that any development has got to be environmentally sensitive and aesthetically pleasing. Absolutely. And any development has to work for all of the stakeholders. No one's going to get everything they want. Never happens. But we want everyone to get some of what they want, because that's only fair. We reserve the right to remain on some or all of the campus. As I said, this is a right-sizing exercise. And again, Rick, the reason why we can't say we are going to stay and we're going to stay on this section of the campus, because we don't know what the market is going to tell us. We don't know when we put it to market after we've done this process. In fact, it'll probably go to the market even before we're finished. We don't know if the market is going to come back and say, wow, we love the hill, we hate that middle part. Why don't you guys stay on the middle part? Or the market comes to us and says, wow, we love that middle part, we hate the hill, why don't you stay on the hill? Or someone comes along and says, we love this whole lot, why don't you just leave? We just don't know. We honestly don't know. So that's why we keep saying we are hoping to get significant breadth in the zoning so that we can all end up with the best outcome. Obviously, we want to make sure that the solutions, the benefits outweigh any perceived negatives. And we also, this is very important, we keep talking about this when we go to town meeting. Obviously, we're not going to be able to get to April 1st. But if we have a special town meeting, let's say in June, what's important is that we in this room, everyone in this room is unified, right? We want it to be that the planning board, the select board, and the seminary, with the advice of consultants, with the advice of council, came up with this solution that we recommend to the town. That's really important to us. We could go to the next thing, Pat, thank you. So let's talk a little bit about three-tiered permitting for the overlay. This is a question that has gone back and forth. So I want to explain how we view the site plan review process going forward for this site. We believe there should be a unique set of standards for site plan review for this site because it is a unique site. Mainly because, as several people have said tonight, there's so much existing building there that's going to be used in almost an identical fashion. So we would say that any repurposing of an existing building should be by right without any additional site plan review because nothing's changing. Any reuse of existing apartments should include connecting structures, by the way, for ADA and other reasons, and you've all seen the plans. We think that should be by right, but with site plan review, whatever this unique site plan review looks like. Why? Because you're going to have some new construction, and you're going to have every right to say, hey, it's too high, it's too low, we don't like the bricks, whatever it might be. Any additions to existing buildings, we believe should be right, by right, up to an agreed size. And again, of course, with site plan review, absolutely. We think any new buildings should be by right, up to an agreed size, with site plan review. And any development above whatever the ceiling for the by right is, going back to what John was saying, then special permit, absolutely. That's absolutely reasonable that there should be a special permit for that. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Here's the logic behind that. The first is that the town, particularly the planning board, you will still maintain control over the process. You don't lose that. And developers, future owners, will know what they can build without additional hurdles, without additional restrictions. It's much, much easier to sell the site to someone who knows that they only have to jump over a 3-foot hurdle and not a 10-foot hurdle. Consequently, the property is more likely to sell in a timely fashion, and the town's tax base will expand in a more efficient and expeditious manner. Patrick, please. In addition to that, if you could maybe make those folks on Zoom a little smaller, Patrick, so we can see the, thank you. I also think we have general agreement on several things. Let's talk about the lower campus, which is the apartments. We're talking about the reuse of existing apartments with by right addition of connecting spaces. Bless you. we would like to see up to 50% of that be allowed for affordable housing. We think this benefits both the town for your 40B credits and the seminary, especially if they are developed by building, because you don't get credit for the whole number of apartments other than in a building. So if we had a 30-unit building and X percent of it was rezoned for affordable use, you'd get credit for all 30 in that building. But if a whole 30 apartment building and another whole 30 apartment building were to be developed for affordable housing at the same time, you wouldn't get credit for the other 149 apartments on the site, because it goes by building. That's our understanding of it, according to our council. So we think it's a good idea, based on how the buildings lay out, for the maximum to be 50%. Doesn't mean it will be, but we think that would make sense. Patrick, if you could please, thank you. We think there's considerable agreement on the upper campus. Those drawings, this is your view. This is a drawing that the planning board produced. It's the repurposing of existing buildings. If someone does something and they don't move outside those 155,000 square feet, then by right. But new additions, we think, is a great idea, up to a total on the Hill of 375,000 square feet. That's less than our original estimate, was 500,000. But we have conceded, based on what your work has shown, what the consultants have shown, 375. We think that should be the by right ceiling for commercial development, labs, whatever it is on the Hill. And then, of course, any additional development would be by special permit. In addition to that, by the way, and I don't show it in the presentation, there's also, of course, the possibility that the Hill could be used for over 55. Madam Chair, you were right when you said that is always an attractive option for a lot of people. So if the market tells us that the timing is bad for a bioscience company or whatever it might be, that might be an option on the Hill. And then you might say, okay, maximum 200 beds or whatever, 200 units on the Hill, whatever is agreed as the ceiling. If you could go to the next slide, please. Patrick? Thank you. Now, as you mentioned, Madam Chair, and I've been predicting this since the day this process started, the real crux is in the middle campus. What do we do about the middle campus? Now, you'll notice that both of these drawings respect those sight lines and things that everybody is concerned about, and the look and the feel, and we agree. We want to respect those things. On the left-hand side is the over 55, the senior housing, et cetera. I think that was David's original drawing that they've used here. And similarly, the life science option. We think 200,000 square feet of additional lab or similar development on that site, AKA the right-hand side, is perfectly reasonable. You can't see it from the road. It's you're building on 6 acres. We know from New England Biolab, 6 acres is more than enough for 200,000 square feet, et cetera. So all we're saying is that we think there needs to be the option for either the residential over 55, et cetera, or commercial lab on that site, because again, the market will have to tell us. Here's the thing. We don't think it's wise to try to predict the market. We just don't, because markets are fickle. If we could have the next slide, please. So what we're saying is we would hope that it would be zoned for 55 plus by right with site plan review, up to 200 units, and/or zoned for lab or commercial with site plan review up to 200,000. Anything over that, special permit. But we've seen it fits, because you guys did a great job showing that it fits. We have the next slide, please. So at the end of the day, I looked at this and I said to myself, and by the way, thank you for this work. Thank you for this report. Thank you for this comparison. I wish Emil was here so I could thank him in person. But when I saw that, I said, we are not a million miles away, because we like scenario 2B. We like scenario 3B. Doesn't mean they're the only scenarios. They were never intended to be the only scenarios. Everything is indicative here, not prescriptive. But when we look at the work that Jonathan and Emil have done, and we see the planning board's high-density scenario, that works for us. That works for us. Now, that doesn't mean we necessarily agree with the way the plan was drawn. That's a separate issue. We'll get to that in a minute. But the point is, if we can sit here in this room and say that the consultants came up with the columns on the left, you came up with the columns on the right, and we're already virtually in agreement on what can go on the hill and what can go with the apartments, seems to me like we're awfully close, folks. If we could go to the next slide, please. So, in terms of an overlay district, I just want to say this has always been an overlay district discussion. It is critical to us that the current zoning remains as the underlying district. Any part of the seminary that we retain, obviously, for academic purposes, would continue to be subject to Dover Amendment and would be unaffected by the overlay district. So obviously, whatever we stay on, we're still doing what we always do, and those protections wouldn't change. Can I have the next slide, please? The heritage buildings. We love those buildings. Retreat House is the most obvious one to preserve. We don't anticipate anyone laying a finger on that, other than potentially to do some additions and things, you know, because it lays out beautifully to add additions to it and still keep the main building and the beauty of it. The other buildings, I got to tell you, Pilgrim Hall and the other they need a lot of repair. And I don't think we could agree, and by the way, all of this is the development agreement discussion, it's not a planning board discussion. But since we're all in the room together and we've got Jonathan on the line, John on the line, it would be very, very hard, I think, to say, oh, it would go with the land that no one could ever take down Pilgrim Hall. It's just a stable, I can't imagine that. But, hey, Retreat House is a different story, and we understand that. Can we have the next slide, please? Access to Browns Hill. We have always allowed unfettered access to our campus, always. And in fact, when the abutters came to see us for our first meeting, one of the first things they said was, do you know when my dog got lost, and one of your seminary students found the dog, walked him back to my house, you know, we come up here with our horses once a year, whatever. We know that. We love that. We think that's great. However, again, this is the development agreement issue. None of us can predict the future. Sadly, we live in a time where college campuses and educational institutions are the target of gunmen. We have live shooter drills at the seminary, believe it or not. I hate to say that, but we do. So security says we can't promise necessarily that there'll always be unfettered access. And future owners may have legitimate security as well as privacy concerns. I don't think we can limit that, especially if someone is doing research, right? They might say, wait a minute, we have a lot of proprietary stuff here. What we would recommend in the development agreement is some sort of language that would allow managed access. So, you know, maybe it's only town residents and they have to show an ID or whatever, you know, in the event someone decides to put a gate up. We don't have a gate. We don't have managed access. We're just saying, in trying to look to the future, we respect that people still want to access it, but at the end of the day, it just may not be possible because of security and privacy reasons. Next slide, please. Perimeter buffer zones. If we think about the Zeef property, which is probably the most exposed, we are absolutely amenable to an additional buffer directly opposite the residence. We think that would be fair. We wouldn't want to go so far as to include the old tennis court and swimming pool area. That's just too far from the property and too far from the house. We think that would be just too much. Bridge Street, there's already a 50-foot buffer zone deeded into the property. We'd entertain another 25 feet if people felt like that would be appropriate. We have no problem with that, no, absolutely none. Next, please. Internal buffer zones, we actually think that should be left up to new developers and new owners to come to you with. We don't think that should be determined in advance. The yet-to-be concept plan, we think, based on what we've seen, most of the things you're concerned about, like the canopy, tree canopies and things, are going to end up preserved anyway. And by the way, especially if we stay on part of the campus, please don't forget that, you know, if we stay on part of the campus, we want it to remain beautiful. And even if we leave, we want it to remain beautiful because we want to leave well. If we could have the next slide, please. A retention of existing walkways, again, it's the same as the internal buffers. Obviously, the town always has to have access to the water thing, but that's separate. The next slide, please. No-build areas. I have to say that much of this property has already been deemed unbuildable. The wetlands and the steep slopes, et cetera. So we're a little wary of designating a potentially buildable site, especially in the central campus, as a no-build area. But again, that's part of the conversation. If we could have the next slide, please. Conservation restrictions, we're open to discuss it, but again, there's already so much legislation protecting things like the wetlands. We're not sure any additional conservation restrictions are necessary, but we're happy to have a conversation. The next slide, please. And the development agreement. I want to make it clear that we agree with John that they are two sides of the same coin. To me, the more liberal, the more flexible the bylaws can be, then obviously the stricter the development agreement is going to be, and vice versa. We understand that. That's how these things work. But please remember that we're not a developer. Right? There are no actual plans here for anyone to say, oh, yes, this is what someone wants to put in there. So with any development agreement, again, we have to be careful not to try to over-predict the future. But in terms of anything that is onerous, anything that is inappropriate, we accept the fact that that's part of the conversation. And then, of course, there's always the enforcement of the development agreement will, of course, be conditioned on future developers getting the planning approvals. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense. So if we could go to the next slide. Now I want to just walk through the iterations of the concept plan. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail here, but this was genius, in my opinion, when David came up with this. He recognized immediately that the property itself laid itself out into these three zones, and I think it's brilliant. That was sort of the first idea. The next slide, please, was you, in the planning board, took these preferences based on the principles, and you started to look at things that you'd like to protect. Okay, get it. Next slide, please. Then, again, the planning board came up with this districts, buffer areas here, buildable here, protect here. Again, we think this was pretty general and made a lot of sense. If we could go to the next one, please. The planning board sketch, again, this was, to me, this is the kind of thing a concept plan would look like, because you want it to be indicative and not, you don't want to plan in people's minds, oh, we're only approving this kind of housing in this particular neighborhood. No, it's not what's happening here. If we go to the next one. Then came the sector plan, and this was started to get us a little nervous. And not that it's not a nice job, Jonathan, it's a beautiful plan, but those roads don't exist. And we are loath to present to the town a picture of the property that doesn't exist. So what we would like to see is, if you have the next slide, please, something that is much simpler and much more generic, where obviously someone would do a better job than my circles, but someone would say, in this area up to this spot, it's zoned for commercial use or 55 plus or whatever, up to, and you list what the ceiling is. And in this section, it's got either commercial use or 55 plus, et cetera, up to a certain number. And the last one should say lower campus. That's a typo, my apologies. The lower campus is the residences reused up to 50% affordable. So I just, when I look at this and I hear what we've been talking about for a while, I come away with the notion that we're really close, that we want the same thing, and let's just agree what those numbers look like. And if we can agree what those numbers look like, I think we have a plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. I think this whole presentation, gets us a lot further down the road than we were before the meeting. This is very helpful, I think, to kind of hear your take on it, and I think you're right. We're not too far off. As they say, the devil's in the details, but I think we can get there if we keep putting in some elbow grease as the planning board has really done. and think of that kind of overall development of the property, and I think the buffer zones, everything, I'm in agreement with most of it. It's just kind of finding those ceilings again. Any other comments from anybody?
I can foresee that we're going to be having lots of conversations.
Well, thank you for your presentation. I think it's very helpful to see where we agree and where we don't. And I'm not saying we disagree totally, but, you know, there are definitely different perspectives here from the planning board and the seminary. But hopefully we can get closer. And I think that this conversation really needs to continue. I don't know if anybody around the table has any comments to make or any questions to ask. I know I have innumerable questions pertinent to the development agreement, and I don't know if you received the information I put together really as a crib sheet, but the first page, well, the first bit of information was from an article called Development Agreements and Questions, I'm sorry, I apologize. It's Development Agreements in Massachusetts, and it's a scholarly article really produced by the Collins Center for Public Management. And it contains an overview of what a development agreement really needs to contain, and there are questions in that article that should be addressed in any development agreement, and of course I had a number of others. But I think we really need to focus on the development agreement soon, because
We
it,
have a meeting in 2 days, I believe.
Correct.
Right.
To discuss the development agreement with the select board. Of course, that's the negotiation. That is the lawyers getting in the room to talk about that, and because it is an agreement between the select board and the seminary. And that is, I believe, happening this Thursday, is that correct?
Correct.
3:30,
3:15, 3:30, yeah.
Yeah, we have a,
So a week from Thursday?
no, this Thursday.
This Thursday.
This Thursday
Oh,
at 3:15.
Okay,
yeah.
thank you.
Question for John Whitten. John, you've already said previously that the zoning requirements or framework of the zoning is going to very much inform the development agreement. Is that a correct statement?
It is. It's a great way of phrasing it, Rick. Yes, it is, and here's why. Because I see the limitations of zoning being kind of reflected in the development agreement. So that which can't be done in the zoning bylaw can be accomplished in the development agreement. And I think the best example is one that Ken Barnes just used a few moments ago, which is the trail access. The trail access just doesn't fit in it might fit in the concept plan, but it just doesn't fit in the zoning bylaw. It could fit in a special permit or even site plan review, but that's not guaranteed. So that, I think, Rick, is a really good example of where the development agreement is reflective of what we can't do in zoning, and it will include, if the parties agree to it, it would include a conservation restriction, an easement, a trail easement, or something along those lines.
So do you think, I'm trying to get a handle on, I want to advance the planning board's discussion on zoning densities and uses while the development agreement is being worked on. It sounds like in the initial stages that the development agreement can proceed along some very general agreements like what you just said in terms of public access and maybe buffering. Is that a correct statement? I don't want to be holding up the development agreement, but I think we need some guidance here on sort of what you think that should be included in the development agreement that shouldn't be in zoning, so we aren't working on trying to solve a zoning problem that you think should be in a development agreement, so we can narrow our scope and focus on the things that should be in zoning, not in a development agreement.
Yeah, no, it's a fair question, and my answer is this: if it belongs in zoning, you're going to know it. So, for example, density and setbacks, dimensional requirements, use requirements, floor area ratio, kind of traditional zoning. Then we start to get closer to things that the town might want to preserve or protect that would never be able to fit in zoning because zoning's reflective of a project. There is no project. So that would be the preservation of a building. That would be a trail easement. That would be specific buffers. Now, the zoning bylaw could build in numerical requirements for buffers, but it could also be in the development agreement. So that's an example of an issue that can be reflective in zoning and the development agreement. Frankly, I think the development agreement is the better place to put as many things that are essential to the protection of the neighborhood and essential to the kind of the payment to the town for water and wastewater, stormwater requirements. None of that can go in zoning. So, again, Rick, I think the zoning will speak for itself. It's been everything the planning board's been doing all these years, dimensional and use. Design is in zoning, but design could also be in the development agreement. I think when we have an overlay where we have an issue that could be in both, it might be worth keeping it in both. And I think we flesh that out as we get into the development agreement. But if I could just say one more thing to the two chairs, I think the big issue in the development agreement that clearly can never exist in zoning is going to be the offset of impacts that we can calculate right now that aren't related to a particular project. And those are typically water and wastewater. Could be stormwater as well. So those kind of offsets that a developer offers to the town in exchange for getting support from the town, those are typically financial payments.
Any questions? I think that was pretty clear.
So any comments from the select board members? Questions, concerns, ideas, thoughts, fears, hopes, dreams?
Well, I have a legal question. I don't know how you can rely on the Dover Amendment while simultaneously maintaining that the underlying zoning applies. And that's assuming that the solution to the issue with respect to the groundwater overlay protection district is resolved. But I mean, you can't have two underlying zoning districts at the same time unless, Mr. Whitten, you can tell me that you can. But that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And then, just so you know, I mean, if you rely on the Dover Amendment, that's section 10.7 of our bylaw, and everything there is site plan review. So these are the issues that I have with the development agreement. And to tell you the truth, if I had the answers to all my questions regarding the development agreement answered, I would be in a much happier place looking at the zoning. But, I don't even know how this campus will be organized. Is it going to be some type of a condominium association so that different developers then contribute to the wastewater treatment center? How is this going to all work as things happen over time? How is that going to be allocated? That's not zoning. That's the development agreement. But unless that's resolved, I mean, I can't even imagine how a developer could look at this property if it didn't know what it was going to be financially responsible for in terms of maintaining a wastewater treatment center if in 2 years there's another entity that comes along and then there has to be a whole new system. How is all this allocated? I mean, these are the kinds of questions I have. What about the roadways? Is the town going to accept the roadways through this property? Or is that going to be the responsibility of some type of condominium association to maintain the roads and plow the roads and mow the grass and all these kinds of things? And so we can go ahead and work on our overlay district, but if the planning board doesn't have a development agreement in hand to be signed immediately after the assuming it were to be approved, the overlay district were approved at town meeting, and if the Attorney General has to then approve the bylaw, that the development agreement has to be in hand to answer all those questions, because otherwise it's kind of like, what are we doing here? I mean, a developer would say, what are we doing here? What are they buying? I mean, we haven't even talked about lotting and how that would unfold. I mean, is it going to be lotting for each sector, or is it going to be lotting as developers come along? So I have a myriad questions, and I won't belabor the point, but.
Given that I think that I'm ignorant, I think you're asking too many questions.
Right, I stopped. I stopped. I have
You
more.
can't do that yet.
Well, but I mean,
Well,
I think that these
Yeah.
things have to be in tandem, and the planning board has to be part of this process. And I really respect that you have been working really hard, but it's been kind of behind the scenes. So the planning board hasn't had the benefit of a lot of the discussions that you have had. So we have proceeded with our concept plan, and so we have a lot to talk about, and it's not going to be resolved at 8:34.
So
That's to my point, because actually it can't be talked about until you know what you're talking about.
Right.
I'm serious.
Richard.
I
So
mean, I
if-
know that's
if-
double talk, but you're trying to solve a problem and you don't know what the problem is yet. You just have to be ready to do anything. And we have general guidelines, we know how we think, we know what we want in general terms for anything. We just apply that and modify it for what the developer or whoever gets the property, ends up with the property, comes and presents. It's called flexibility. We can do that.
So to back up a little bit, at the beginning of that barrage of questions by Marnie, she asked John Witten about the overlay versus the Dover versus the by right residential at the moment. So if you could give some clarity to that, that would be great.
So Dover, I want to make sure I understood the question, Madam Chair, but Dover is agnostic as to the underlying district.
Right.
So the use that is protected under Dover, whether it's educational, religious, or other protected uses and structures, that use is going to override the underlying zoning regardless as to use and likely as to structures, but not as to site plan review. So site plan review does apply to Dover, but I think it was said earlier, and I apologize, I don't remember who said it, site plan review can't be used to be tantamount to denial.
Right.
But site plan review is applicable to otherwise Dover protected uses. So if the question is, does the underlying district nominalize or remove the Dover protections, the answer would be no. Because Dover is, again, agnostic as to what the underlying district is, as long as it meets the educational or religious protections. So, Madam Chair, was that the question that was being asked?
Well, I guess I'm somewhat puzzled by the Dover.
Into the microphone, Marnie.
Puzzled by the Dover Amendment, because I've read that it applies to the entire site if you have the appropriate use there, or does it just apply to buildings?
So I represent Mass Audubon, and Mass Audubon has a lot of Dover protected parcels. So it is possible for a parcel of land to be protected by Dover, but a structure on that parcel not be protected by Dover. The key question always is the use of the building or land protected because of an educational or religious purpose. So it is possible to have an otherwise Dover protected campus, to have a structure on that campus not be Dover protected. And we have some recent case law, most notably from Regis College on that. So it's really one of those questions you can't answer until there are facts to respond to. So it is possible to have an entire site protected under Dover, or it's possible to have it kind of be Swiss cheese. Some portions of the site don't have Dover protection. The use is used commercially or for profit, whereas other portions of the site meet the educational or religious requirement test.
So, Jonathan, all of the...
Can you take off your mask so I can hear you?
All of the existing buildings that are there, were they to be sold, could not be used for anything without a change in the underlying zoning.
I don't know
Or
if I can
they
answer
could not
that.
be used no, because commercial and apartments are not allowed in underlying zoning.
Yeah. So if there is no underlying zoning that is usable, then those structures would need to get a rezoning, apply for a variance, which they wouldn't lawfully be entitled to get. So there would have to be some relief through a rezoning.
Right. So they're not liquid assets in that sense.
You have a question?
Yes, can I make a?
You come right on up to the microphone, David.
Good evening. I'm David Gamble. I'm an architect and urban planner with Gamble Associates. We were a subconsultant working with Abramson Associates over the last, really, I would say 4 or 5 months with the seminary and also with the town. I just wanted to make a few remarks. I do believe, as Ken's slide indicates, that the two parties are closer than they may appear. At the same time, people do want different things, and I think it's just important to recognize that. The town is looking for economic development, alignment with other goals, including your soon-to-be updated master plan, and some transparency with the public. And I do feel the initial public meetings, which drew a lot of people, interested people, and I thought was a fairly robust conversation about the future of the site. So, Madam Chair, your fears and your questions are not unfounded. This site is a big deal. It's the largest property, it's the highest property, it's got immense potential for the town and the seminary, and I do think that is an area of commonality. The seminary, for its part, is looking for economic development, also some flexibility, and community support for what they're doing. But the community, for their part, is looking for public access, open space, and probably to limit development to the potential that they can, which rubs pretty directly with a developer who may want to maximize development potential, expedited review when possible, but also is looking for some community support. So I think this is a hard conversation to have, and there are lots of questions that have yet to be determined, but in my experience, those questions are coming from a concern about change, and that is typically what most people fear. Is just a change from what it is today. But rest assured, it will not continue to be what it's been for the last generations because of the dynamics that Ken had mentioned. The biggest difference I see, and I also appreciated the sequencing of drawings, is the challenge of representation. And you brought this up. What does the public see? And I'm going to disappoint you by saying even a fairly articulated plan is not a very good way to represent a place. It's an inefficient mode of representation because it's primarily two-dimensional on a site that is actually quite spatial. As well as densities are not very fully understood by most people. An FAR of 0.3 versus 3 is enormously different, but most people don't know what that means. And even when you say a buffer of 25 feet, that depends. I counted these ceiling tiles. This room is about 27 feet long, wide. That's about the distance that Ken was talking about from a buffer. So zoning, so the plan is ineffective. Densities are actually a very poor indicator. And zoning itself doesn't necessarily result in a great place. And that is what most people were looking for, is a great place ultimately, as well as economic development. So zoning, unfortunately, traditionally, has not resulted in the types of places that most of us sort of enjoy, because zoning is largely about the separation of uses as opposed to how they come together. So I just wanted to reinforce the challenge really is in the things that you might rely upon most: densities, plan drawings, zoning aren't fully adequate. Which is why I think that the idea of I don't want to say simple, but maybe a simplified version of what was drawn at the planning board is more appropriate if it follows principles, if it follows areas, density, whether it's called campuses or neighborhoods doesn't really matter, areas of growth, and finally, what are the ranges of possibilities of densities? So while I appreciate the delineation of building footprints, that goes too far because it's too prescriptive and in fact could be radically different than what a developer eventually proposes. And so we often face this challenge in our work, is how do you represent the ambitions and the intentions in ways that both allow for flexibility but also some certainty. And therein, I think, lies this challenge, and more dialogue is going to be necessary because no matter how this gets drawn, I can guarantee that a developer will likely not do that. And you need to make sure that you're anticipating that, which leads to a slightly more, I think the word was ambiguous, I would say more generalized set of intentions. The last thing I want to say is that the principles that came out of the public meetings, the principles that the planning board developed, I think were very smart and quite articulate, and therein an interested developer is going to try to do all they can to maximize relationships to the landscape, to guard against abutters, to put parking below buildings. A lot of people talked about the allure of New England Biolabs. What's important is that that is 200,000 square feet of development on a fairly compressed site. And almost without exception, many people in the public meetings said, we think that's a great model. Okay, what matters then is how they did it and how it actually gets completed, and that really is about the development agreement. So I don't mean to be combative, I just want to sort of identify and underscore the challenges of representation, which ultimately, if that's what the community wants to see, is not going to be enough.
So that's all very helpful. Can we put some meat to the bones in terms of what you think the community should see? Because we've been talking about a concept plan, and I think Marty was right. When we get to town meeting, we can't talk in the abstract. They're going to want to see something.
Right.
So what is, from your perspective and your advice and your guidance, what is that something look like? We have the last plan that I think you said may be too detailed. We have Gordon Theological Seminary's recommendation at the end of their last presentation with general areas. We have your initial presentation. Can you give us some guidance as to what you think would be most helpful in illustrating?
Sure. I didn't mean to suggest that the people can't read plans, but even designers sometimes can't read plans. What works best in my experience are vignettes, little drawings of approximate views of relationships between landscapes and buildings and roads and places. So perspective drawings of what you will actually see from particular places that are three-dimensional and spatial.
So
and
some
those,
elevations of different.
not even elevations, perspective drawings of what a place looks like from particular vantages, from the most important vantage points. Because even when you look at a plan, if you don't know the heights, the densities, and importantly the landscape contours, of which this site has many, it could look very different. And people are often disappointed because they look at a plan and they see the result and they think, that's not at all what I thought it was going to look like. So what we try to do is to identify a range of views and vantage points that are most communicative and give you the best sense of what you ultimately might see without designing the buildings. And that's an art.
Gee, I see an expansion of scope.
No, you don't.
I was tricked into that one.
Well, no, I think that's very helpful because that's what I've been struggling with is, we've got these plans, but I think that advice is very helpful because you're right. We don't know what these buildings, how they're going to look on that piece of property, and we don't know how any of those will look, but I think showing people, here's what we're talking about in terms of potential densities, size, shapes, and locations, and if we can do it in 3D, and I know that's pretty expensive and involved, maybe Jonathan has that capability, would be helpful.
Right, but on top of any kind of perspective with respect to the buildings, you have to include the parking. And so the parking is that can be difficult. I mean, if you need considerable amount of parking, then you have to go to some kind of levels with retaining walls and whatnot, and the amount of green space is then curtailed. So if you're going to have a commercial use with considerable parking, that will impact the desirability of any expensive residential use.
You're absolutely right. Parking drives so many things, but I'm sure, as Mr. Whitten would agree, is that that's something that could be written in the development agreement that says over a certain size threshold, parking needs to be below a building. That's what New England Biolabs does. That's why it actually looks pretty good. Certainly, there's lots of surface parking, but the bulk of the users are below the building, and that's where the topography here is at your benefit.
Yeah,
because you can use it. I disagree that the top of the hill is unbuildable. That's actually where you can most accommodate tuck under parking. And if it's at a large enough scale, that actually justifies the expense of going below.
Yeah, I believe that was a brief thought we had at one of the meetings a while ago, was underbuilding parking based on different scenarios.
Yeah, but it takes a certain size to justify that economically, and that's the trade-off.
That's much more understandable at the top of the hill, which is, well, it's difficult to say if that would be a more likely a place for commercial development. I guess it's almost
Right,
impossible
but
to say.
even what I would call the central campus has some elevation change, and if a developer really wants to do something, she is going to find a way to do it in a manner that's sympathetic to the principles that were established and respect the aspects of the landscape that are most precious, because it is so valuable of a place. And the right developer is going to try to do that, the right thing.
So I just want to back up from the specifics of parking and get to something more general, which is, my understanding is, for us to start writing a code, or for anybody to start writing a code, the first thing that we need to get to is something that's beyond kind of a general zone area, and I'll call it instead to a mosaic, where you've taken every component or every area of the site and you've broken it into, we'll say, zones or sectors. And so there's no leftover space. It's either it's wetland, or it's this zone, or it's that zone, or it's all delineated. And when you do that, what's interesting is it starts to beg, where do you draw the line in those mosaics? And that starts to get at what should be in the development agreement, what should be preserved, what shouldn't be preserved, where should parking spread to or buildings spread to, where shouldn't it spread. It gets to a lot of interesting questions, and I'm not here to answer those questions, but backing up, first of all, the concept plan that the board presented has no buildings on it. It does have indications of where roads might be. That's not necessarily prescriptive. It's more indicative of something that should be considered. But to me, to get out of the gate, we need to get from just a series of sort of ovals or polygons that sort of cover the site back to a mosaic which basically identifies every square foot of the site into one zone or the other. And we're not there yet, and that's an interesting conversation that I look forward to.
May I respond to that?
Please.
I think you're being unrealistic about what the parameters need to be set for a developer to do a project here. Every line you draw is in fact a boundary. And where a building goes is going to be dependent upon a whole lot of other factors that are outside your control, including, most importantly, a right-of-way of a street. So you can say that these lines that represent streets are not really streets, but in fact, they delineate areas. The areas delineate parcels. The parcels describe a size. So it goes too far because it anticipates things outside of your control.
I'm removing the roads from the discussion. Let's just, for argument's sake, remove the roads. No roads, okay? We just go back to the existing conditions plan. My understanding is, in order to start to draw a code, to draft a code, we need that plan to turn into a mosaic. In other words, where no area is undefined. Every area has a color. Okay, that's what I'm getting, forget the road, forget the roads.
The more legal term would be a regulating plan.
Exactly.
Probably in black and white without color.
Perfect.
Indicating areas of buildability, of wetlands, of buffer zones,
Absolutely.
of pathways. So your red dash line, to me, that's a suggestion of a framework. And the framework is probably the best term to use here.
Yep.
And flexible framework, even better. There are principles about alignments and relationships. Those are the things that a developer would want to know, and those are the things that can clarify the sense of campus, which is another principle that came out of so many conversations. I think a piecemeal is an inappropriate description of what even the bubbles represent, because it suggests that the teams aren't thinking about this whole area synthetically, and in fact they are, and they will, even if different developers do different things.
So I guess
I don't think we're saying too different of things.
I agree with everything you said, except for to draft a code, I don't think we can just have bubbles that move around. We have to have bubbles that stay put. Forget the color, forget the roads, forget all of that. Just delineating which is Zone A and which is Zone B. There has to be a line between those zones, and an interesting discussion is about to be had about where's that edge.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not sure, maybe John Whitten has an idea, or other people in the planning board have an idea about how to draft a code where you can't draw a line between Zone A and Zone B. I'm not sure how to do that. That's all. That's the only point I'm trying to, that's the only point
and
I'm trying to make.
I'll let the land use
Only
attorney say. I would say that there are gradations in relationships as opposed to black and white.
And that gets to the flexibility, because as people have alluded to, the upper campus, those buildings may never sell, and they may be knocked down, and that may become over age 55 housing or some other residential use. So we've got to be flexible in anticipating other potential uses than we're talking about now. So
For campus, of course.
Yeah, I think if we're thinking, as we've talked, I think, often about the middle campus having assisted living or age 55 plus, we can't write that off for the top of the campus either. Like I said, we have to leave it open. I mean, because somebody may buy C, or the lower campus, and the same entity might buy the top two parcels, or they may be all three separate. We got to kind of make every option on the table.
Basically, what you're saying is you have to be flexible enough that when somebody does buy it or proposes to buy it, that we can accept the plan that they have, and it will fit with our overall guidelines. So I don't think we should get too detailed, too far down into the weeds trying to prescribe what's going to happen, because we don't know.
Can I just ask John Whitten, would you agree or disagree that we need to have specific edges of zones? Or can those zones be, and I'm prepared to be redirected here, can we write a code where we don't have a definitive map that says where those edges of different zones are?
No. Just easy question. The answer is no. There has to be a definitive boundary. Town meeting is adopting a zoning district, a new zoning overlay. However it's labeled, they need to know where in the real world on the ground that line is. Now, having said that, there can be a lot of flexibility in zoning. It's, we label it flexible zoning, but that is internal to those lines. So we need to know, everybody needs to know where the line begins and ends within the district. As we've been talking, there can be quite a bit of flexibility, whether it's high density or medium density or low density, whether it's special permit or by right. But to answer Jonathan's question directly, no, there has to be a line. And I didn't hear David saying he disagreed on that exterior line. What I think I heard David say, and maybe it was in a prior meeting, it's more the flexibility within the bold lines that town meeting is adopting.
I agree with that 100%, but my point is that what's I think is an interesting exercise is to figure out where the edge of, let's say there's only two zones. Where's the edge? Where's the intersection of those two zones? That's an interesting discussion. And I think we need to get to agreement on where those lines are. And I'm not clear that we have an agreed upon set of lines. That's all.
And Jonathan, I agree with you. And if I could just, Madam Chair, or Sean, if I could just add. So the board's familiar with this. When two zones abut each other and there's a parcel of land that has a use that might straddle both zones, the typical response is the more restrictive zone can be applied to the less restrictive zone for a distance, 20 feet, 30 feet, 50 feet. So to Jonathan's point, where those two zones abut each other, A and B, there can be flexibility as long as town meeting has an objective number it's approving to allow the more restrictive zone into the less restrictive zone for vice versa for a distance of X feet. So that would be the one exception, but even there you can see that we're still drawing a definitive line, but we're providing some exception to it with a numerical standard.
Does anyone
Thank you.
else have any comments or questions?
I guess I'm trying to wrap my head around the delineation. Do we need to delineate?
Yes,
I think the answer was yes.
Yeah, but
Yes.
I'm saying is, I guess let me flesh it out in my head here. Give me a minute. Talk amongst yourselves. Let me come back. I'm trying to figure out how to ask the question, but I'll think of it in a second.
Yeah, no, we need boundaries, delineated boundaries, and it sounds like we have flexibility within those boundaries, a lot of flexibility in terms of uses and densities, and it sounds like those boundaries can encroach upon each other for some defined distance, and that's where we have to go. I mean, I think it's pretty clear from my perspective is we develop those boundaries, we'll pick those zones, whatever those zones are, and then just say, okay, within this zone, this is what we want.
Right.
And this is where internally we're going to have a lot of debate, because some people say, I want more, some want less. Then we've had the planning board, the select board indicating what they want, and the Gordon Theological Seminary indicating what we want. That's the discussion where we're headed. I think that's the only way we can get around this.
It would also be very helpful if we had a sense of what the market is likely to produce for this site. I mean, I know...
Good luck.
Yeah, good luck. But I know Barry Abramson did not do a market study. He evaluated various uses in terms of strong, fair to good, this, and that, and the other. But if the seminary has thought about engaging real estate professionals, they might get some feedback as to how this is likely to unfold and in what time frame.
Madam Chair, we've been in conversation with real estate people from day one, and this Friday, we are actually interviewing prospective representatives of the property. If I mentioned a name, you'd recognize it. Multinational company, very interested in representing us because they recognize the potential of this property. I just want to say something about the issue of the zones. I'm trying to figure out why we aren't just sticking with the zones we've been talking about. It seems to me that it was just so obvious by David's work that the areas where there are existing apartments constitute a zone. The Pilgrim Hall up to the road, as it were, was the middle campus, and everything on the other side of Graham all the way up was the upper campus. It seems to me that the delineation of these areas is not that difficult to figure out. It's kind of already there. And then once we have that, which is what I tried to allude to in my presentation, then let's talk about where we agree, and we agree on so much. So if we pick off the low-lying fruit, and we get to those contentious areas, I'm convinced if we've done the other thing well, there's enough goodwill left in the room for us to figure out how figure out the middle campus or whatever it might be. So to me, I think, let's try to stick with those 3 campuses, as it were, that originally came out of the proposal that I put up on the final slide, and then let's just figure out what happens inside those areas. I think we don't have to make it more complicated than it is.
If I may, Mark Johnson again. So I think this has been a really excellent conversation, and I think some great points have come out. I think the enemy, if there is one, is the calendar. You have June is going to come quickly. By June, you want everybody on the same page. You want, all the contentious issues behind you. You want to have, the maps all done. You want to have enough of the education. I think citizens understand when they're being pitched, and they understand when they're being invited to participate in something. And so you need a stage of both. You need this participation section to bring people along, and then as you get closer, you're going to say, this is the plan, or this is the range of the plan, this is the implications of the plan. I don't think you want to do it all the last week. I don't think you can't do it all by Facebook. There is a process, and the calendar is against you. And so you obviously have some major issues to work out, and I think everybody appears to have really good faith to work on them, and I encourage you to do it with post haste, and to not worry about the dotting the i's and dropping the t's quite yet. Get the big picture stuff done, because if you just waste weeks and weeks and weeks on little things, you'll never get the big things done in time. So anyway, sorry to run on, and I just think you're so close. Stay focused, work hard, and thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Joe, you wanted to...
Just to briefly add to Mark, for anybody watching at home, I'm Joe Domilovitz, I'm the town manager. I've enjoyed the conversation tonight. I think there's a lot of good on both sides. But to build on what Mark said with the calendar, I think it's great that you're having, I think I agree with Mark that we need to get some of the big picture items agreed to and move on, because once you get into the public process of hearing from the residents in a public hearing on whatever the new draft zoning is, that's when you're going to, all sides should probably be willing to modify a little bit based on the feedback you get in the public hearing process. I had a question for Jonathan. I mean, we talked earlier today about kind of what we needed to come out of this meeting for you to start to help draft zoning. Do you feel like you've gotten most of what you were looking for today to be able to help the planning board start to put something to paper? I know, from my view, we've gotten some that can help us start our development agreement discussion on Thursday. So I'm just wondering if you've got enough of what you're looking for.
I do, Joe. I think, I think that the disconnect, for lack of a better way of saying it, is going to be in the details. But certainly in terms of the concept, the concept of the overlay, not the concept plan, I think I do. And, there's no harm in me drafting and then having folks respond to it. And I do think Thursday's discussion will help illuminate the zoning, and the zoning will help illuminate the development agreement. So I think after Thursday, the answer is yes, Joe.
Thanks.
Perfect. That was going to be one of my next clarifying questions, so you beat me to the punch.
Well, I would just remind everyone to take a look at the issue of the GPOD, because from Emil's calculation, 1/3 of the seminary site is within the GPOD. More than 1/3 is within the GPOD. And if more than 1/3 of the site is in the GPOD, then the entire parcel is within the GPOD. And so that has to be addressed before we can move forward.
Yeah, but I think those are all good points, but I take to heart what everybody said. Those have to be aside now. Those will get resolved. We can't keep nitpicking this in terms of concerns. Those are fair concerns, and they need to be addressed at some point.
Well, I think
But
sooner
this is like a
rather than
funnel, and we got to start pushing stuff down the funnel. And we get the big things done. As get to Jonathan's point, is the zones, the whatever they are, and then focus on the details and get those done. They'll inform the other decisions.
So staff will make sure that we address the question about the groundwater protection overlay district and have an answer for the planning board before you meet next.
It can be resolved. I mean, there's a way to
Yeah, it's
to
not
do
a-
it.
It's not
We'll
impossible.
make sure we have an answer for you about what it is and, where we stand on it and what needs to be done to address it.
Well, I think I think the ball's in the seminary's court on that one. I mean, it will have to take the steps to resolve the issue. It's not something that the planning board or the town can do.
I did see one of the chat comments was about making sure that handouts at the meetings were available to residents, just in the interest of answering that question for the public. I think that, yeah, that's always the goal. Unfortunately, some of the materials for this evening were not ready in time to be able to be shared publicly, but that said, I think I'll ask if all sides can make an effort to have your materials prepared enough in advance so that we can have them online, so that people who want to watch the meeting on a given night will be able to call them up by downloading from the website.
Patrick has all of them.
I don't know if we had them in time to get them online.
Oh, no, we got,
So, yes.
the seminary's late this afternoon, but Patrick has all of the assembled documents.
Yeah, we'll get them up online this week.
Yeah,
so
we
that
can add them
people
to
who-
the packet.
So that people watching later on Shelby Camp can have access to them. But I'm sorry that they weren't ready tonight, but we'll do better going forward.
Right, it happens sometimes, unfortunately. Nature of the beast.
Are we done? Or do you want to keep going for another hour or two?
Not me. We have to continue the conversation. We have our regular meetings scheduled, and we can always, and we will continue to have this reuse initiative on our agenda. So, gentlemen, you're invited to appear and continue this conversation. It's a bit difficult to conduct these conversations in public. Do you have to negotiate the development agreement through the open meeting?
No, we don't have to
Procedure,
negotiate
no.
it through the open meeting law, but in order for it to be accepted, it'll have to go through the select board in a public meeting. So it'll be negotiated quietly, well, not quietly, but it'll be negotiated the way you normally do conduct negotiations, with attorneys in the room, and then we'll bring the negotiated agreement to the select board, and the public will be able to see it.
Okay, well, if no one has any other comments or questions, I will entertain a motion to adjourn the planning board's portion of this meeting.
Motion to adjourn, madam?
Second?
When I call your name, would you please indicate whether you are in favor of adjournment? Pat, well, you're an associate. I'm not sure you get to vote on this, but you will be a member soon.
Pat just wants to go home.
Bill Wheaton?
So moved.
Oh, you moved. We're voting on the
Say
motion.
yes.
Agree.
Yes, yes.
Jonathan Poor,
Jonathan Poor, aye.
Rick Mitchell,
Aye.
Richard Boroff,
Aye.
Beth Herr,
Aye.
Marty Crouch, aye. The planning board is adjourned.
All right, I would entertain a motion from the select board to adjourn as well.
So moved.
All right, a second?
Second.
Thank
Second.
Caroline. And we'll do a roll call vote. We'll start with Caroline online.
Caroline Boyer, aye.
Tom Myers
Tom Myers, aye. Damon Knutson, aye.
and Sean Farrell, aye. The select board is adjourned. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight online, here in person as well.